Hey, you're listening to Hear This Idea, a podcast showcasing new thinking in philosophy, the social sciences, and effective altruism. In this episode, we talk to Gillian Hadfield, who is Professor of Law at the University of Toronto and is also the inaugural Schwartz-Reisman Chair in Technology and Society. Gillian has written articles on really an eclectic range of topics, and so our interview hits on questions in a bunch of different areas, including law, economics, and artificial intelligence. We begin the interview by talking about why humans invented law in the first place, and what Gillian describes as the demand side for legal infrastructure. We then move on to discuss why social norms continue to be really important, and look back all the way at ancient Athens and how it managed to function on a largely decentralized system of collective punishment. Gillian then lays out her paper on regulatory markets and her vision for how governments in the 21st century can keep up with these rapid advances in technology. And lastly, we conclude the interview by talking about Gillian's idea of silly rules and why lots of seemingly arbitrary norms actually play a really important role in society. As always, we've included links and further readings in our write-up, but without any further ado, here's the episode.
Okay, I'm Gillian Hadfield. I'm a professor of law and a professor of strategic management at the University of Toronto, and I'm director of a new institute, the Schwartz-Reisman Institute for Technology and Society at the University of Toronto. A problem I am currently stuck on, it's a big one, which is how are we going to build machines, artificial intelligence, that can navigate our normative world, can integrate well into the normative world that humans have built. And this is a big problem. It's a problem to be stuck on because actually the normative world is really, really complicated. And I think many of our current approaches kind of take it for granted and assume it's going to be like just reading facts in the environment. So yeah, sort of a fairly abstract 30,000 foot level, that's the problem.
Yeah, well, I'm sure we'll delve into lots of these problems during the course of our interview. But as you said, this is a huge problem, which has got so many different angles on it, right? Computer science to philosophy and to, as you mentioned, law and economics. And I'm really curious about what kind of attracted you to this intersection of both law and economics. Before I started reading your work, these were very much like two different disciplines. And I found it really exciting how you've been able to merge these two.
It actually goes back to my undergraduate days. It took me a very long time to settle on a discipline because I was just interested in everything. And I just treated the course listings as kind of a buffet. Oh, I'll have one of those and one of those. And so I ended up in this social and political philosophy class where I read John Rawls' A Theory of Justice. And as I read that, I'd taken a bit of economics. It was really a merger of, on the one hand, thinking about the big questions about what's the right, the fair, the just way to organize human societies. But he approached it with a fairly structured, quasi-scientific, formal method, minimax theory, and so on. And so actually, I actually thought I had invented the field of law and economics because, here's two things you should study together. You should study the theory of and how we structure societies and the formal stuff about how do actual relationships work, prices and organizations and so on. So it was intellectually for me the very beginning. And then I went to Stanford to do a joint PhD in economics together with a law degree. So I'd been kind of putting it together from those early days. I then discovered I had not invented the field. In fact, it was an established field. But I also discovered that they were asking questions I wasn't that interested in. What's the efficient rule for contract breach or the right rules for corporate governance? And to be honest, where I am in my career right now, feels like I've come full circle because I'm finally saying, okay, I can use those more formal methods, modeling, computational methods, and so on, to think about those big questions about what's the right way. How do we build better human societies? How do we build better relationships? So it's been there from the beginning, really, sort of linking those two together.
Mm. So I suppose we'll start off with a softball question. Why did humans invent law? And I guess since we're talking about this intersection of law and economics, maybe another way of putting that is, where does demand for laws come from? Why would we ever want to club together and come up with laws telling us what we're not allowed to do?
Right, right. And it's a softball question because it's part of the subtitle of my book. So why did humans invent law? So let's take a step back. Why did humans invent rules? Why do we have rules that say, this is the way you should talk to somebody, this is how you should share resources? If I'm using a set of tools, how should you treat the tools that I'm using, and so on. And those rules or norms, the way I look at it, humans invented those in order to give a basic infrastructure to our cooperation, a basic way for us to understand and work together. And that's really the most important thing about what has made humans such a vastly more productive and successful species than any other species on the planet. And of course, it requires cognition and language and all kinds of other distinctly human things. But fundamentally, it requires cooperation. So rules and norms are the fundamental infrastructure of cooperation. And cooperation is the secret of our success. So why law? So the way I think about law is it's a step in the evolution of that kind of normative infrastructure that responds to the fact that as our societies grow, they become more complex. So here's the economics part. As societies grow, we get greater division of labor, we get greater specialization. Instead of we all go fishing and help build the fire and so on, right? You do the fishing, I build the fire. We become more specialized. Somebody actually starts being the one who says the blessings over the fire, and somebody else says, well, let's build more permanent huts, or we get greater specialization in the division of labor. And that makes the world more complex. You and I are less alike. And so it will be harder for me to predict what you think is the right way we should be doing something. Like if I'm sitting under the trees, I figure out a great way to make new types of bows for bows and arrows. And I train some apprentices, some young people to do that. And now I spend my days sitting under the tree, supervising my apprentices. Well, that might look like I'm lazy under our existing set of rules. But we might need to change our rules. We might actually need a new rule that says, no, the person sitting under the tree is actually doing something we now recognize as work, right? We don't see it in the same way, but it's new. As that becomes more complex and we start to need more rules and our rules need to adapt to situations they haven't seen before, we have ambiguity. So I think the fundamental thing that law is doing is helping us resolve the ambiguity by creating a structure that says, okay, we're going to create an institution. It might be this elder or the shaman in the group, or it might be this town council. It might be courts and the Supreme Courts, right? We create that structure and we say, this institution, this person, this institution, they will be our ambiguity resolver. When we don't agree what is the rule, and we can't figure out what is the rule, they will announce a rule. They will interpret our existing rules or announce a new one. And we will all recognize that every one of us is going to recognize that when Luca says sitting under the tree is okay, because actually we think it's productive and that's what we're all about, or the person sitting under the tree has contributed in the past and it's time for them to be able to enjoy that and adopt this supervisory role, that we all know that we are going to say, okay, what Luca said. And I will then be able to predict in the future, whether I'm going to catch grief for sitting under the tree. And the apprentices will know that, she's not going to disappear because, in fact, nobody's going to come around and say, hey, what are you doing? Get back to work. That's what I think law is about.
I really like that explanation as well. And this kind of emphasis on common knowledge, I think is the term for laws. So not just that everybody knows what the rules are, but everybody knows that everybody knows what the rules are. And from there, right, you can build cooperation and you can build understanding. One thing I would love for you to maybe explain in a bit more detail is this idea of like how norms function in all of this and why these kind of informal things are really important too.
In trying to sort of develop theory about this, which is what I've been doing for the last couple of decades, I guess, because as I said at the top, sort of what's the big problem is we just don't have actually really good theory about this. Like we're the fish swimming in water. We are swimming in our normative environments, and we're so good at being part of them that it's very hard to get an external perspective. So one of the first things that I've done, and this is in work with Barry Weingast, who's a political scientist at Stanford, is we step back to say, okay, let's not even talk about rules. Let's talk about classification. This is a concept, of course, borrowed from computer science. And let's just talk about the fact that basically everything anybody does in the world is classified. You can do that, you can't do that. It's okay, it's not okay. It's going to get you grief. It's not going to get you grief from the people in your group. And this classification, this normative classification is pervasive. I mean, it's governing everything from like how you and I are talking to each other right now and how we all got dressed this morning and you know what we'll say when we talk to somebody later this afternoon. Is governing everything. It's just a classification that says what's okay and not okay. And humans throughout the long period of their history have always classified that behaviors. You can use this kind of bow, but you can't use that kind of bow. You can eat this kind of food, not that kind of food. This is how you build a fire. That's not how you build a fire. And I use the language of norms for that informal classification. It's emergent classification. There's often generally not any single person or entity that's saying, here's the classification. It's just that we've all interacted, maybe we've all made comments, and that has been an emergent property of our interaction that we've landed on a classification. So the informal norms, I think you want to recognize that they predate law, they predate formal rulemaking, and they probably were all we had for maybe 100 or 1,000 years or more. And they still continue to obviously occupy just a huge part of our normative infrastructure. So think about the pandemic, right? We've been evolving new norms throughout this process. I mean, there's been like informal norms about is it okay or not okay to wear a mask in this environment, you know, to stand this close to me in the grocery store or that close, right? A lot of that, you know, we've also developed some formal rules about that, but that the classification has been mostly this informal norms. And I think this is like the thing I think people miss when they think about how we're going to build like machines that will be safe and in line with our norms. People focus on it like there's a relatively small number of norms. They're the big questions. And so like we focus on what our high courts and Supreme Courts are deciding, big value questions. And I want to say, you walked outside of your house, or maybe you didn't this morning, you were just swimming in a sea of classifications of do it this way, don't do it that way. So it's incredibly rich, but the informal norms are as critical to that normative infrastructure as the formal stuff.
A common impression is that when we're talking about norms, is that these things kind of maybe emerge organically or at least like bottom up, right? They're very decentralized. Whereas I think most people's impressions of laws is like very much like a top down thing, right? Like the government kind of imposing laws onto its citizens. And you also have a paper, right? That looks all the way back at ancient Athens. And I was wondering if you could maybe give like a brief overview of this and what kind of lessons you learned speaking to this question of decentralized versus like centralized control and rules.
People do exactly as you say. They tend to say, what do we mean by law? Well, we mean governments that come down and write the rules and then enforce all the rules. And so we went out looking and say, well, you know, we have things that look like law, which is to say we have a mechanism for resolving ambiguity about what is acceptable or not acceptable, what's okay and not okay. But we can't, in lots of societies and points in history and places in time today, we don't see a centralized enforcement regime. So step number one was to separate this concept of classification from the enforcement of the classification. So that's step one. So that's a theoretical move. That says, what is a normative infrastructure, or what we call a normative social order? It's a combination of a classification institution mechanism and an enforcement mechanism that tends to get people to please choose the things that we've classified as okay or acceptable, and don't choose to take the behaviors that we've said are not okay, not acceptable. So ancient Athens is one of the really cool examples of this. It's, of course, famous often and studied in political science and so on as, often seen as one of the first democracies. So the word democracy, has its roots in ancient Greek. But what was really interesting about the Athenian society that emerged after, periods of time when it's the elites that are creating the rules, and they create whatever rule they want, and they could tell you, it's this one versus that one, and, they could change it whenever they wanted. They didn't have to announce it ahead of time. What Athens creates in this sort of democratic period is they create formal, centralized institutions for doing the classification job. So they have these massive assemblies, 6,000 person assemblies, more than that, to write some formal rules. And then they create the jury system, which again is a little different from what we think of as juries. These also could have up to 6,000 people participating in the jury. And the litigants, in order to get into court, would have to point to one of the written laws to say, okay, I want to sue Finn because he didn't pay up for this deal that we reached in the Agora. He didn't pay up, so I want to bring him into court for that. And there's no regular judge. There's no and there might be all the citizens in Athens took turns playing formal roles, so they might serve as year. So there might just be a logistical thing of who do I go say that to, right? And how do we, I guess, get the jury chosen? They have this really cool random process for choosing the jury that's representative across these different groups and locations and rural and so on. And you get a decision. Okay, Finn, I'm sorry, the jury has decided you haven't paid and you owe me money. But all I get out of that process is that decision. There's no police for me to turn to. There's no bailiff. There's nobody, a sheriff I can ask to go and make you pay up. I have to get my friends. You might voluntarily pay up, but if you don't, I have to get my friends and neighbors to come and help get you to pay up. And that's a decentralized enforcement system. That's what we'll call a private enforcement system. The importance here of that common knowledge that we just spoke about a bit is that everybody was at the jury. In fact, the Athenians invented common knowledge structures, these curved spaces where everybody could see everybody else. Like, you're not sitting and seeing people's backs of heads while the argument is happening. You can actually see everybody seeing it, and they can see that you're seeing it. So everybody knows that everybody knows that everybody knows that was the decision that was made in the court. So that's this combination of a centralized classification scheme that allows all of us to be confident of what's does Finn owe Gillian money or not? But then a decentralized system for enforcing that, which is the system we've been relying on, like I say, and we basically throughout almost all of human history until really the last few hundreds of years, where we've had some centralized enforcement, like police forces and prisons and jails and so on. That's to me the cool part about Athens.
And I guess just to maybe summarize and draw out like some of the key lessons here is there seems to be like a really important dual role here that like laws and rules require. One is this classification thing. And as you mentioned, this kind of common knowledge of everybody knowing what is right and also knowing that everybody knows that. And then the second thing being this enforcing thing, so that if somebody then violates this classification thing or is on the wrong side of the rule, that then there is some form of punishment there. And in both cases, there have been some decentralized ways to do this. In Athens, you could fit these 7,000 people in this room, and you could maybe have like some sort of social stigma or something around, which we still see maybe today with like mask wearing and things like that. But as you mentioned, as kind of time has progressed and societies have become more complex, there's been this increasing demand to have formal mechanisms doing this. So rather than just attending a big hall, you have these things written down in law. And rather than kind of relying on these social stigma things, you can actually have a police force or some other form of kind of state power to then actually enforce these fines or something.
Although even in that setting, right, think about that mask example, right? I think everybody's experienced over the last year just how important the enforcement by ordinary people is, right? Like if, what drives you to sort of put that mask on or take it off is to some extent influenced by your prediction of what's the likelihood that a police officer is around who's going to fine me for this behavior. Most of us are thinking, okay, what's everybody on the street or in the store or my friend going to think? And it's this thinking through, what will other people think? How will they understand my behavior? How will they respond to my behavior? That's that key reason why you need a centralized classification scheme of some kind, or a classification scheme of some kind, is it's risky. Like you think about the person who's going to criticize you for not having your mask on. That's risky behavior. It's less risky for them if they can say, hey, you don't have your mask on. There's a mask mandate in place, right? But before we have a mask mandate, it's riskier to do that. And so they may be less likely. So it's less likely to be kind of an enforcement tool that we can use.
Let's skip forward a few centuries and let's move over to the States. We have a situation now where to be a lawyer is a profession, and there are licensing requires to be a lawyer in the same way that you need a license to become a doctor or something. Can you just tell the story of how law became increasingly complex and professionalized through the 19th and 20th centuries in the US?
Yes. I've mostly studied the Anglo-American world. So this is happening sort of certainly throughout the Anglo-American world. I think beyond that as well. So I just want to say that's where I've done my research. But the story of that is, and it's related to the Industrial Revolution. So, right, we have, 18th century, we have significant changes in economic activity. And through the 19th century, increases in the scale of economic activity. So we go from a primarily agricultural society with small craft and artisans and, markets, exchange, literally, right, bring your produce to market or bring your crafts to market. We have investment. We also have some banking and that kind of thing. But the Industrial Revolution, one of the things that happens there is we have this, all of a sudden we have a whole bunch of new types of activities and new types of relationships. And what that creates is this demand for law. That creates this demand for, hey, what is a demand? A demand is just, I could do something more valuable if I had this, right? If I had an umbrella right now, I'd have a more valuable day if it's raining. I have a demand for law in the sense that I can enter into my transactions with lower risk. My partners can be more willing to take the risk of investing if we've got confidence that we have a structure that if we don't, when we say we're going to split the profits, that we'll have that investment. I feel more confident as an employee if I know that there are rules in place that say, my employer is not allowed to lock the doors to the factory, that I'm entitled to clean air in the workplace, and you can't have toxins in the factory. That creates a demand for law. It's a demand for rules that basically help us coordinate and say, yeah, I'm willing to participate. To me, that's all that law is in this normative sense. It's just this thing that says, okay, folks, I feel confident, you feel confident, let's continue to move down this path and do this new activity and engage in this new thing and take these risks together. Because complexity and interdependence in an economic sense is tremendously risky. As soon as you get nervous about that, you retrench. You say, no, I'm going to cook, grow my own food because I don't trust the food that others are growing. I'm not going to take that job where I'm exposing myself, making myself vulnerable to how my employer might teach me. I'm not going to get in the car that's driven by somebody I never met and hand over cash. Right? It's how we manage all that creates this demand. So the way I think about the emergence of law, there's lots of law, lots of law in the 19th century floating around, but it's being produced in these very local places. The town council is producing it, right? It's this village has its rules. Right? We don't have very much that's all right. And in the U.S., what starts to happen is as the scale of economic activity grows, so you're building the railroads, right? Trade is traveling much longer distances. That creates a demand for, I'm in New York. I want to know what the rules in Ohio are, right? If I'm engaging in transactions there. So one of the things we start to see is, so at the start of the 19th century, unlike in England and Canada, in the U.S. at that time, anybody could practice law. There were no law school requirements. You didn't have to study for 3 years. You didn't have to, like you have to do now, take the bar exam, big exam, and become a member of a bar association. You had to go to a court somewhere and get a judge to say, okay, yes, I'll admit you to the bar. But, famously, Abraham Lincoln never went to law school, and his advice to anybody who said, I want to be a lawyer was just, well, go read a lot and keep reading a lot and read a lot of law books, and then you'll find a judge who will admit you to the bar. So one of the things that the legal lawyers in the 19th century in the U.S. start to do is to say, in a sense, I would say one thing they're seeing is a demand for, their better law, law that's addressing really the commercial needs, right? Now, there is also a story that the lawyers who organized to start saying, hey, we need to professionalize. We need to start creating requirements of who can be a lawyer and who can't. We need to require law school. We need to require membership in our bar association where we can discipline lawyers. A certain amount of that is elitism, it's anti-immigrant, it's racist, it's driven by, we don't want just anybody in our profession. So there's that thread there as well. But from a kind of fundamentals and economic, why does it take off? I think it actually works pretty well to create a structure of courts like what we would recognize today, a very standardized structure, uniform procedures, and much more sophisticated and careful, professionalized systems of producing law. So we get the requirement that you have to go to 3 years of law school, you've got to be a member of the Bar Association, and you have to follow the rules of the legal profession to do that. That sort of all gets solidified by the time we're into the Depression, 1930s, and so on in the United States.
Okay, and of course, all those changes still persist, right? So you still need to go to law school to become a lawyer. You still need to pass your bar exam, join an association. Like you said, that worked really well in the past. That was an improvement. But are these fairly strict requirements to become a lawyer still best? And what's a better way of doing things if they're not?
Yeah, so I think they aren't still best. I think they have outlived their function. And the critical thing here is that what lawyers did, and this was very, very deliberate in the United States, it was ultimately organized through the American Bar Association, was to draw this line around who can practice law, right? And so that had the effect of saying, we'll increase the quality and the training of who's practicing law. But especially under the pressure of the Depression, which was a time in the United States when actually, so lots of changes happening through the beginning of the 19th century, 20th century. And we're starting to see all kinds of organizations provide legal services. So the banks are saying to their banking customers, oh, come into the bank and we can also help you with your will or your transactions. And the automobile associations are saying, we can help you with, in thinking about insurance and give you legal advice about risks. And we're seeing all these corporations starting to provide legal services. So the key thing that the bar associations do at this time is they say, not only does somebody who's providing legal services need some training, like a law degree, they also have to operate only with other lawyers. Corporations can't provide any legal services. So the banks can't provide legal services, and the co-op grocery store can't provide them, and the automobile association, the union. They say it has to be lawyers operating in law firms, only working with other lawyers. And this is the point at which, what's driving this is the commercial interest of lawyers. It's tied to the idea, well, you have to be well trained to be a lawyer. And, we need to exercise some discipline and control to make sure our courts have integrity, all of which continues to be true. But where we found ourselves today is that those rules roped us to this early 20th century model of how legal services are produced, priced, who comes up with them, who designs them. And they cut law off from kind of the fundamental, innovative kind of stuff that markets do. When new people come in and say, I have an idea about a better way to do that. And they cut law off from the structures that we use in other markets to support risk-taking, investment, finance. So if you can't form a corporation to provide legal services, you can't get investors, you can't access capital markets, you can't get venture capital, and you can't say, hey, lawyer, join up with this computer scientist and this management expert and this psychologist, because we figured out that would actually produce a better way of solving people's legal problems. And that's why I like to focus on this ground level theory about the demand for law, the demand for rule, normative, legal infrastructure. So I think where we've ended up is this regulatory structure for law and lawyers that we locked into place in the early 20th century is now critically interfering with our ability to build the kind of legal infrastructure we need for a world that is just transforming at incredible pace.
I think it's just worth emphasizing that we're talking here about the US, and even just today, if you look at different countries, there are like some very different approaches here, and especially when it comes to this licensing thing, this just seems, right, like at least from a kind of British or UK perspective, a really weird thing that to get any legal advice, you need to be a licensed lawyer. I don't know if you want to speak about that at all.
Yes. So actually, the rules are in some ways the harshest in Canada and the U.S., where they do have this rule that says any legal advice, help filling out a legal form, any legal advice, understanding your rights at work, all of that has to come from a licensed lawyer operating in a business model that's approved by bar associations or ultimately Supreme Courts and law societies, sometimes ministries of justice, but attorney generals, but not a lot of oversight there. The UK is actually a little different. So England and Wales has always said, actually, anybody can give you legal advice. Anybody can give you help with legal forms, documents, help you draft a contract, help you draft a will. They can't say they're a solicitor. They can't say they're a barrister. They have to be very clear with you that no, I've been a union rep for 20 years, and that's why I think I know the rules. There have been rules about how lawyers can operate in the UK, and those started to change, about I guess it's getting close to 15 years ago now. And some of those rules are changing in the US and Canada quite slowly. But the restriction on who can give you legal advice, who can help you understand this complex, I mean, you probably, well, you do. You all sign legal agreements probably 5 times before breakfast if you click on a little box that says, I agree, right? It says, I have read and I agree. Of course, none of us read. We have no idea what we're agreeing to, but we just click that thing so we can get onto the page or get the app installed or whatever. So we live in these really what I call law-thick environments. But the rules in a lot of places, including the United States and Canada, are that the only people who can give you any help with that are licensed lawyers who are going to charge you a lot of money for that and really don't have a business model that can help you there.
Okay, so it sounds like a major problem with these licensing requirements in the US and Canada and elsewhere is that law just can't innovate fast enough to keep up with the pace of change in the world. Maybe that rate of change is nowhere faster than in tech, and specifically with AI. You've written this paper with someone from OpenAI, Jack Clark, called Regulatory Markets for AI Safety. We'll talk about this idea, but first of all, could you just, I suppose, explain what challenge AI poses in particular for the more traditional kinds of regulation, and what are those traditional kinds of regulation in the first place as well?
So I like to use this language of regulatory technology, which is what is the means by which we take the decisions that have been made in our political institutions, what's fair, what do our workplace rule, what are our workplace rules, how safe does it have to be, how do cars have to drive, how much risk, what do people who want to sell you securities have to tell you, all that kind of normative choice making that happens in our political institutions. That has to somehow get translated into a process that will actually get what you said you wanted to have happen actually happen on the ground, right? That you really learn these things before you sign a contract, or your workplace is actually this safe, in fact. And I call that regulatory technology. And one of the consequences of this closure of the legal market, right, the way in which lawyers drew that line around it and said, everybody who participates in this market that produces legal goods and services has to be trained in the same way, can only have financing from other lawyers, has to operate in this particular business model known as a law firm, a solo practice or a law firm. That closed market had produced a regulatory technology, which, like we've said, worked really well through the 20th century. So more formal law, more structured lawmaking, regulations written in sort of standardized ways, litigation processes that everybody understood and were pretty constant and uniform across different settings. It worked pretty well, but it's not going to work well at all for the challenges of more complex technologies, globalized technologies. And if we're talking about AI and the rate at which, AI, sort of the complexity of AI, the speed of it, the scale of it, that existing regulatory technology is, kind of to put it bluntly, write it down, get it passed by a legislature or a regulatory agency, have public officials monitor for whether there's violations, or private entities that say, hey, they're violating the rules over there, and then file enforcement actions, either regulatory enforcement actions or lawsuits, and then make decisions and then impose penalties. That approach, and that's just very, very grossly speaking about the way our regulatory technology works, can't keep up with the complexity of modern technology, especially AI. It won't keep up with the speed. And that's exactly what we're seeing. We're actually, I think, in the domain of AI, and then more broadly speaking, digital technologies, so social media platforms and so on, we really just don't have an effective regulatory regime because nobody knows what laws we should pass. Nobody knows how to write them. And then even if we did, they'd be outdated immediately. They're probably not very well informed because most of our AI technologies are being built inside private corporations, and they're protected by copyright laws and patent laws and trade secrecy and employment regulation. So I think and you just won't be able to, you won't be able to keep up because it'll also be, you'll write something in there about today's technology. And of course, a year from now, it'll be a totally different technology, or there'll be aspects of it that we don't understand. So I think it's pretty clear that our existing regulatory technology is not fit for purpose, and that we need to be thinking about how are we going to change the way we produce regulatory technology, not what new law should we pass, like should we allow people to publish this or not publish this online, how are we going to get better content moderation, how are we going to make sure data is protected better, from privacy intrusions, et cetera. Most of our focus is still on how are we going to use our old tools. And I want us to be talking about how are we going to change the production process for those tools, because we need new ones. And the only way I know of to generate new economic stuff, because I think regulatory technology is economic stuff, is to figure out how to attract investment and energy and money and brains to solving that problem.
And you've got this great analogy here of this value of this outsider perspective coming in and shaking things up in these completely new ways, right? There's this kind of new technology. And that's about kind of librarians and search engines. Do you want to maybe explain that to listeners?
Yeah, so this is an analogy I drew, trying to drive home why it was that I love lawyers. I've educated thousands of them. Many of my best friends truly are lawyers. But I don't think that they can expect to be the ones who will come up with this new technology. And that's just because innovation doesn't happen in like closed bubbles where everybody has the same education and everybody processes problems in the same way and everybody speaks the same language, basically. And so the analogy I draw is to what happened with the problem of search on the internet, sort of in the early days. And I've been around long enough, and was actually at Stanford in the in the 80s and part of the early 90s, sort of when the internet is just emerging. And what people are seeing is the problem of how are we going to, we're connecting all these computers. How are people going to find stuff? Like, how are you going to know where to find the documents you're looking for? Like, which computer should you go look at? Whose computer should you try and access through the internet? And everybody's expectation was that we would solve that problem the way we had solved the problem of how do I find information I'm looking for previously in print, which was with libraries and that kind of librarian's classification, keywords and Dewey Decimal Systems and, coding systems that says, okay, well, we'll put all the stuff in English about, biology in this big group, and then we'll break it down. And a librarian was like your expert navigator, right? Go to the research desk. They will help you find the gem of an article or a book that you are looking for. And in fact, one of the first, obviously big portals on the internet, Yahoo, this is how they operated. They hired thousands of people to classify web pages, to go read the web pages and create classification systems for them. So you could say, I'm looking for help building model airplanes. And some human had looked at all the possible pages and put them in a little pile so you could go find them that way. And you have, librarian research journals at this time talking about, okay, this is like our holy grail. How are we going to organize this massive information? Because of course, as you know, it's in volume, it's growing in leaps and bounds year by year. And of course, what we know is the way that problem was solved had nothing to do with classification and librarian technologies and loads of human readers putting labels on things. It was solved, Sergey Brin and Larry Page saying, "Oh, we're computer scientists. We're not librarians, but we have an idea. What if we looked at the pages that were linked on each of these pages, and we looked at how much people clicked on those links, and now we'll just use our software to keep track of those links, and we'll come up with a ranking that will say, well, most people who put this word into the search bar, they clicked on this, and they clicked to a page that a whole bunch of other people clicked to access as well. And so you had this ranking system based on that click, the popularity of the clicks. So, up until that idea comes out, nobody is thinking that that's how you solve the problem of finding stuff on the internet. Now we can't think how you could do it differently. And we know all the problems we now face with it as well. So I always say, look, if the librarians had been organized and regulated the way that lawyers organize and regulated, they wouldn't have allowed Larry Page and Sergey Brin onto their turf. They would have said, sorry, you can't participate in the market for search results. You can't provide a service, sell a service for finding stuff on the internet, because that's what we do. And you need a librarian's license and training to be able to do that. And sort of, draw that analogy to say, but we really do want to make sure that we're letting people who have never thought about your problem before, like how do you solve a regulatory problem, who haven't taken my class in contracts or, my colleagues' classes in antitrust or whatever. We want people who are thinking about this from totally different directions to have the capacity to come in and say, I've got an idea. What if we did it this way? And that's sort of that nub of innovative spark that we desperately need in the production of regulatory technology. We still need to regulate to make sure they're not selling snake oil. I mean, now we know we actually need to be figuring out how to regulate the search engine process because, maybe in the back now the algorithms are being manipulated so that the ranking is putting too much weight on, Google's own products or pages or something. But it's still how we have to get there. We have to get there with more innovation.
And just kind of, I guess, thinking this analogy through, there might be one dissimilarity when we just think about how well-funded librarians versus law firms are. And just kind of from a political economy perspective, this might just be a completely different challenge, right? In order to get this breakthrough and to get these new technologies, as you said. Yes.
It's been a challenge I've been thinking about for 20 years. Yeah, because they invented a perfect system, particularly in the U.S., a really perfect system that it was like, okay, well, it'll only be us. And in fact, it's going to grow so complicated, nobody outside of the system can understand it. And everybody will fall down dead in front of lawyers. And then we will have these organizations that put up their hand and say, we're acting in the public interest, but are clearly protecting lawyers' interests as well and slowing down change. So I do think it's a much harder problem. In fact, the librarians were not organized in that way. And, Google could, come in and totally upend that market.
Mm-hmm. Before we talk about AI specifically, there is this idea of a way of coming up with regulation which involves some of these kind of market forces, which is just the idea of a regulatory market. Could you just explain how they work in general?
Sure. This is joint work with Jack Clark, who I'm a senior policy advisor at OpenAI. He was formerly policy director at OpenAI. He's now got a new company, Anthropic. So the concept of regulatory markets, which I talk about in the book as sort of initially sort of setting out the ideas. So the thought here is to say one of the things we want to separate out is what I would call the normative question of what kind of outcomes do we want? How safe do we want our cars and workplaces to be? How much risk do we want people who are buying legal services to face, that they will get bad advice or wrong advice or corrupted advice? So that's our what do we want our outcomes to be? And then, as I said, there's this regulatory technology question. Okay, now how are we going to translate that normative or political decision into actual changes in behavior on the ground? Like, what do we have to put into our processes? And as I was mentioning, our old-fashioned method of doing that is we write down on a piece of paper, or now an electronic document, legislation and statutes and regulations and so on, and that's our technology. But as we look at a much faster moving, complex, globalized world, I think we're also going to need just actual technology. Like, the best way to make sure that self-driving cars are safe might not be only to write down a set of rules about, here's how they need to be built and so on, but also to have some technology maybe that's constantly monitoring the data that's being generated by the cars or the models that are being supplied down to the cars. And that kind of technology is only going to be produced in a market, I think. There could be public investment in it as well, but I think it needs to be built on a system that attracts private investment. I want the people who are building this, some of the engineers who are building the self-driving cars, to have an incentive to spin out of and, to find each other and say, let's build, and I have a better idea about how we could regulate these things and make sure that they, for example, reflect local community values when they decide the risks between going around, how much room should you give to a bicyclist? How much, what risk should there be that we don't recognize a bicycle crossing the street in the middle of the road with paper bags or plastic grocery bags hanging from the handlebars, which is sort of one of the stories of, I think it was one of the Uber crashes. You want to be able to create those companies. You want all that energy of like the startup culture and let's build this new thing in there. So that's a market. So the concept of regulatory markets is to say, okay, so we want to create those kind of companies. Let's call them private regulators, because the product they are producing is regulatory services. They are making sure that this car is safe, making sure that the car is following the rules, your self-driving car, whatever, or content moderation. It's making sure that the actual content that's showing up on a social media platform is compliant with the values of some relevant community, political community. So they're providing regulatory services. I'm going to call them private regulators. And they could be profit companies. I think that has to attract some of it. It could be nonprofits. It could be other organizations, but they're private companies. And the concept of a regulatory market is, okay, we don't want anybody in the market providing these services unless we've had government oversight to make sure that they're in fact focused on achieving the outcomes that have been set in our political sector. So if I'm a private regulator, I'm not deciding what are the values that should be reflected in online content on a social media platform, right? The legislature or some town council is deciding that, some political group. But I'm being regulated by the government, by an oversight body, to make sure that the technology I produced is doing what the government wants it to do, or that oversight body wants it to do. Then say to like the social media platforms, what I call sort of like the targets of regulation. Okay, you have to buy regulatory services, and you have to buy them from an approved regulator. So it's a bit like saying, if you're going to be a public corporation and you need your accounts verified by a licensed, certified public accountant, it's like saying you must have your financial statements certified, and they must be certified by a licensed, certified public accountant. So this is like, you got to buy regulatory services, you got to buy them from an approved private regulator. So the sense in which this is a regulatory market is it's competition between the providers of regulatory services to solve the following optimization problem. Subject to the constraint that I maintain my approval by government, how can I grow my market share? Well, how can I grow my market share? By being a more attractive regulator, provider of regulatory services. And so that gives me an incentive. If, let's suppose private regulator A comes in and says, well, I'll just do what we've been doing. I'll write a bunch of rules down and I'll hire investigators and then I'll penalize violators of the rules. But then, some smart engineers and business people from, a company producing self-driving cars spins out and says, we could build a machine learning model to help us here, right? Let's get all of our customers to share data with us and allow us to monitor and maybe even intervene directly on how the parameters are being tuned or something. That may be a more efficient technology. So now, the self-driving car company as the target that has to buy these services has a choice in the market. Do you want to be regulated by the company that does this with a lot of written rules, or do you want to be regulated by the company that says, well, share your data with us, and actually this is going to be a really transparent process for you? That's how we create incentives to build that. That's like, okay, you can go to the librarian to help you find stuff, or you can go to Google to help you find stuff. And we know how that competition works out. Admittedly, again, that we got lots of needs for regulation that are arising in that space. Like this is a conversation that has changed a lot over the last 15 years. But that's the concept of a regulatory market.
So maybe just to summarize what you said there, in this regulatory market model, we have these three parties. We've got these private regulators, then we've got the companies, and then we've got the government. And the government kind of just sets out these goals, which private regulators need to kind of hit in order to be awarded these licenses, in order to be allowed to operate. And then these private regulators can then kind of set out whatever regulation they want in order to achieve these predefined goals, which then will attract, hopefully, companies to subscribe to these regulatory models. And then that's how this kind of works. And there's clearly some upside here that this can cause a big incentive for innovation. It can bring in a lot of new talent, bring in a lot more money to try and experiment with these things. And I guess also just makes the job for the government a bit easier, where it can just focus on outcomes and objectives rather than getting tied down on the specifics of like machine learning or artificial intelligence. And then on the other hand, I guess it's also just more transparent, right? For the public, rather than like using jargon or words, politicians are kind of held a bit more accountable and actually having to specify what social outcomes they want, and then voters being allowed to vote on this. So this all sounds really great, but I can also imagine that this sounds weird and possibly worrying to some listeners. In particular, whenever you use the words competition together with regulation, there's kind of a couple of alarm bells going off. And we saw, for example, in 2008 with these credit rating agencies, that there can also be this kind of race to the bottom, right? Where regulators or these kind of private credit rating agencies really let things slip through or start colluding. Can you speak to that and maybe how your private regulatory market system would want to avoid these outcomes, or more generally how to think about this relationship between companies and regulators?
It's really important to, not be Panglossian about any of our systems. So I've been studying institutional design basically throughout my career. And one of the key points that you make in the study of institutional design is that you're doing comparative institutional design. And the fundamental problems, it's like hydraulics, right? The fundamental problems don't go away. People are greedy. People will cheat. People will, to make profit, companies will, skate close to every line they can skate close to. They will rig the systems so that the car will figure out that it's being tested for emissions and will change its emissions, right? So if we think about the Volkswagen scandal, as an economist, right, that's what you study. You study the incentive to maximize within whatever constraints is being imposed. So it's absolutely right to think about how will private regulators do that. They're going to be self-interested. They're going to be profit maximizing. They're going to try and do whatever they can do. So what that says is that you need to design the regulation of the regulators to do your best to get that market to work well. Well, that's exactly the same problem we currently have now. It's just that what we're trying to do is say, let's let governments design the regulatory schemes that will keep our powerful companies in line. And I'm saying they're bringing, they're bringing a water pistol to a gunfight, right? They're just not going to be able to do that. And we need some more powerful tools and technology there. But we absolutely have to think about what's the regulatory design that gets our private regulators to do what we want them to do. So that's not an easy problem. I part of what I'm calling for is to say, we need to start working on how do we design the regulation of regulators? How do we design that oversight mechanism? What metrics can we use? Where can it work? I'm not saying this is going to work everywhere, but we need to start experimenting and building that out and discovering how that can work better. So you need to have regulatory bite, regulatory teeth in regulating your regulators. I do think that has some attractive features. It's like, okay, we're going to measure accident rates. We're going to audit content on the systems that you regulate, private regulator, and we're going to say, look, we've set a maximum percentage of inappropriate content or harmful content. We say, okay, so if you're not meeting that, then we're either going to take away your license or we're going to require you to correct it within a period of time. It might be principles based. It doesn't necessarily have to be metrics based. This is the way actually that the regulation of lawyers in the UK operates now. UK Parliament has said, here are the principles and the goals for regulation of lawyers. And our independent regulator is going to decide who is allowed to regulate legal services. And we will keep reviewing the results of those regulators to see whether or not that's what's happening. Not saying it's working great, but it's a problem we can continue. It's like, instead of continuing to solve the problem of like, what should we put in the legislation to tell social media platforms what they can and can't have online, let's put our efforts into figuring out how can we effectively regulate a private regulator. So point number one there is these are real risks, and we have to design systems around them. We have to design to respond to that. The whole thing doesn't work unless you have effective regulation with bite of the private regulators. That's a critical feature. But here's what I also want to say. This is the comparative institutional point. We currently have very little, almost no regulation happening throughout this sector. Or put another way, any regulation we have is being chosen and implemented by the companies producing the services themselves, what I'm calling the target, right? The Facebooks and the social media platforms, the Googles, the Apples, the self-driving car companies. They are regulating themselves. We have a massive default to self-regulation by corporate profit-making entities happening right now. And we are not going to be successful in saying, oh, let's just pass a lot of law to correct that problem, right? Let's have that direct regulatory relationship using our old regulatory tools. Let's ask the lawyers to do it for us. Just want to say it is not going to work. So all the risks you identify are absolutely real risks in the model that I'm proposing. It's a conceptual model that I'm proposing. We need to do lots of design work. We need lots of smart economists and politicians and technologists and political scientists and psychologists. We need a whole bunch of work done to design this system and figure out. And I would say, let's do it the way we do everything else. Start small, test it out, pivot, minimum viable product, follow those kinds of procedures to build it out. But I just want to get the focus shifting because I really, really worry about the fact that we actually, anybody who says this to me, like, oh my gosh, you want to put private corporations in charge? I'll say, private corporations are in charge right now. I would like independent private corporations with different incentives to be playing a bigger role here. And I'd like to start taking seriously and redesigning our regulatory oversight problem to be one we can actually solve.
I just had a quick question here. We're talking about regulatory markets in the context of AI. You mentioned self-driving cars, but I was just wondering if you could throw out some more examples or more issues where potentially this kind of agile regulation is going to be really important.
Oh, so I think the ones that I start off with are the ones where it's very clear we actually need technology to help solve the problem because of the speed and scale. So let's think about automated decision making and the risks of bias, and even just a very simple version of that. Where the type of bias we're talking about is arising from lack of representative data in the training of our models. Now, if you have a kind of naive view about how machine learning models are built, you'd say, oh, they have a data set, they build a model, we'll just go check the data set. So turn over the data set to our investigators, and they'll check it for representativeness. Well, of course, the real world of building models is you're iterating constantly. The data set is changing. Maybe you're actually training on real-time feedback and use of a model, like, with how people are responding on their devices and so on. So I think we're very clearly going to need probably machine learning-based models that will be out there evaluating the representativeness or the bias in our automated decision-making models. So that's as hard an innovation problem as building the automated decision-making system that can say, who should I give a loan to, or who should I hire for this job? So I just really would like to get some of our brilliant technologists and business people and entrepreneurs thinking about, oh, let me build the models. And we do actually have companies starting to emerge like that. So that's an example where I'd say, okay, so now let me, as government, regulate the company that's saying, we have a bit of software that can validate and check for bias in models. You, government, will tell, government should be telling that company, what kind of bias should you be looking for? Which demographic groups do we want to make sure are represented, right? What are we looking for? Oh, and by the way, if you discover biases we hadn't thought of, please tell us about them so we could also add that in. But I think that's an example. We've mentioned content moderation. So this is something, for example, I met recently with some government officials who are contemplating drafting legislation to deal with the problem of online harms. So people saying, violent things online, or inciting violence, or, revenge pornography, or, stuff that's harmful to children, polarization. But they're using the existing technology to do this. They're saying, okay, let's write a law that says, thou shalt not have the following kinds of things on your social media platform. And let's give a right to people who are harmed by that to sue. And then we'll have a court or a tribunal make a judgment. And then we'll write into the law, this is kind of an amazing thing, you have a right to have that information removed within 24 hours. Like, this is just completely disconnected from the real world as far as I can tell. But we know we can start to develop technologies that can manage the volume and perhaps find creative and new ways to make sure that the stuff that's showing up in your news feed or on your social media is aligned with values. Maybe there's ways to allow you to select your own metrics for how you want to do that, right? And so actually, my son, Dylan Hadfield Manel, is a new professor at MIT, but he's got to start a company that's starting to think about, how do we do this? How do we How do we create the metrics? Are there techniques and tools we can use as a technology solution to better align the content in a news feed or online? And so I think the technology areas are ones. I think places where I would certainly pick as places to start. Places where you can actually have some kind of a metric you could measure. Those would be ones I think. Privacy is another one, right? Like right now we have a very, very complicated rules about de-identification and so on. And saying, why aren't we auditing? And why don't we have a watermark on data that allows us to audit for when data has gone to some place it wasn't allowed to go? Right? I mean, that's how the diamond traders actually have, they now use laser tags, very, invisible, but tags to say, oh yeah, that diamond wasn't supposed to be there. It was supposed to be over here. So I think if that's what you were asking about, sort of like, what are the possibilities here?
The one last question I had on this topic, and asking about how this might work in practice, that I think kind of relates to the very first bit of our discussion here, is about like what law and stuff actually is maybe a worry in two parts. And that is that once you have a lot of regulators, you will just get lots of different types of regulations and different companies following different types of regulations. And that creates some complexity in itself. And we talked right at the beginning of our interview about this importance of having common knowledge. So not just people knowing what the rules are, but everybody knowing that everybody knows what the rules are. But there's maybe a worry here that like, could this not end in a place where people are really confused, right? Because if they want to trade with company X, they also need to know what regulations or what rules company X follows. And that might be completely different to all their different trading partners. And that can create some sort of barriers or complexity. And then I guess a similar but somewhat distinct worry here as well is that if regulators keep innovating, and keep changing the rules that they're offering in order to attract companies, that creates a lot of like uncertainty as well. Like government might not have the best regulation, but one thing that it does do is it's very slow to change, which is a drawback, but also just gives some certainty in kind of being able to plan investments 5-10 years ahead. Whereas if we're constantly seeing these new technologies evolve and constantly seeing new innovation, then that can be really difficult. And that can mean that companies will like hold out from investing in things because they're not sure what the rules are, and that private regulators may just suddenly change. I know that these are like, again, big kind of open questions, but I would love to see your take on these two issues.
Great question. So this is why I took us, take us back at the beginning to just that really, really fundamental question, as you say, of what is the function of law? What's the purpose of law? Why did humans invent law? And they invented it in order to support their cooperation. They invented it in order to allow complex, interdependent relationships to morph and change and thrive and gain investment and participation. So now if you think about that function and you say, okay, and the way we solved that problem for millennia has been we have a set of rules and we write them down, or we have a law speaker who is the guardian of them who will tell us what the rules are. And largely because we've had that decentralized enforcement system, again, throughout most of human history, the way we've coordinated on, do I think these rules will be followed, has been by common knowledge of the rules. This is also why I say it's really critical not to define law as a set of rules. It's a way of getting to classification, and the confidence you want is confidence that the outcomes are likely to occur, that the outcomes that you've chosen through your process, the food will be safe to eat, the car will be safe to drive, the workplace will be safe, the social media platform will not expose you or your citizens or your children to harmful content. The confidence you need is in the confidence in achieving that outcome. So if we have this regulatory market and we have, let's say globally, there's 10 different providers of regulatory services for content. But let's suppose they're all held to the same oversight standard of what they're supposed to achieve, like there can't be more than 5% content that the community would say that shouldn't be there getting through, because you can't get perfection, right? We know you can't get perfection. The confidence you need is that those outcomes are being achieved. But you might have, like I say, you've got 10 different, they might be following very different ways of achieving that outcome. Some might be following this rules-based approach. Some might be using technology. Some might be building machine learning models. So I don't know what comes next. That's why you need a market. You need some innovation, because I don't know what the right answer is for the best way to achieve that. But I don't need common knowledge. We don't need common knowledge of the nitty-gritty of the rules. We need common knowledge that it's a stable, effective system in place. That when I go in and I interact online, I get on into the car on the highway, I go into the workplace, I need confidence that there's stable infrastructure here that is aligning the behavior of companies with our collective choices about what we think is fair and right and safe. And that's actually, so that's why you need to go back to the theory part and say, don't mistake the means for the ends. Don't mistake the way we've accomplished these objectives in the past for that's what we need to do, right? What we need is common knowledge of the rules. Believe me, most of us have no idea what the rules are. I guarantee none of us are reading those things that we're clicking I read and agree every day, right? We don't really know what that is. So we're actually in a very, very bad state there. And what we don't have is good confidence that there aren't sneaky things in there that we don't approve of in a collective sense.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let's switch topic for the last few minutes. We've been talking about AI, but let's just jump back to talking about rules, short of laws. You're part of this quite original and fun paper talking about something called silly rules. Natural first question is just to explain what silly rules are.
So we've defined silly rules. This is joint work with Joel Leibo and Raphael Custer at DeepMind, a couple of other team members at DeepMind, and also Dylan, Hadfield, Manel. So silly rules. We've defined these. We've taken the world of rules, and so there's two kinds of rules. There are ones that have an actual direct impact on welfare. So those are things like don't steal my stuff, pay up what you promised to pay me, make sure that there's not toxins in my drinking water. Important rules. Direct impact and welfare. If that rule's not followed, people are not as well off, or societies are not as well off. And then we've said, okay, we're going to define a silly rule as a rule that has no direct impact on welfare, right? Wear a dress that comes to your knees, or wear a dress that comes to your ankles. So a silly rule is one that if that rule was broken, materially nothing would change. Wear this kind of clothing, that kind of clothing. Eat this kind of food, not that kind of food, even if there's no health impact of the food, right? It's just, we don't eat dog. Some places they don't eat cows. Other places they don't eat snakes, right? It's a silly rule in the sense that it has no direct impact on welfare. And one of the things we're doing just initially with this definition, and this was original work with Dylan and McCain Andrus, is to say the world is full of silly rules. If you just look out there at our normative landscape, there's a ton of rules that we follow and care about that really nothing would be different materially if we didn't have that rule.
So I guess then the big question is, why do we have all of these silly rules in the world, right, if they're not actually achieving anything for welfare? And you had this really interesting kind of unique methodology in trying to explore this question, where you had this foraging game, right, of these different agents. Can you actually just explain what this kind of, I guess, almost experiment was that you ran?
Right. So we actually built or made use of a reinforcement learning system at DeepMind in which we created these artificial agents, which are just neural nets that are optimizing. And our agents are, it's a multi-agent setting. Our agents are playing a 4NG game, just in a grid world, 2D space, virtual space. And the grid world is populated by all different kinds of berries. They're just different colored bits on the squares. The agents get reward if they figure out how to navigate to a square with a berry to consume it. So that's a foraging. You could say it's a foraging game. There's no competition over resources. There's lots and lots of berries. So in a sense, they don't need to cooperate at all on the eating part of things. They just need to. So these are. So it's reinforcement learning. So the agents don't come in with anything other than this reward function. You'll get points if you find your way to a square. So it's just the same as when we build reinforcement learning systems to play Atari games or whatever, and gain score, gain reward. But in this environment, we introduced one of these berries is poisonous. So if you eat the pink berry, you suffer a health consequence, which just means that future berries that you eat produce less reward for you. But there's a long delay between when you eat the berry, the pink berry, and when that health effect kicks in. So it's 100 time steps until that health effect kicks in. So what we wanted to look at was what was the impact of introducing normative infrastructure into this environment. The first time we run this game, just like I described it, and the agents can't figure out that the poisonous berry is poisonous. They never learn to avoid the poisonous berry. And the reason is because of a credit assignment problem. There's just too long a delay between the eating of the poisonous berry and the negative effect. So many other things have happened. Once they get sick, they can't go back. They can't figure out what in the last 100 steps or whatever that I did caused the illness, the reduced reward. So when you run the game like that, the agents eat the poisonous berry and they never learn to avoid it. It can't solve that credit assignment problem in this reinforcement learning setting. So we looked at what's the impact of introducing normative infrastructure. This team from DeepMind has got a number of really nice papers which introduces the capacity for agents to punish each other. So that's that decentralized enforcement. They have a punishing beam. They can fire a punishing beam at another player, and that it's costly. It costs the agent points to use the punishing beam, and it causes even more damage to the agent that's hit with this punishing beam. And they've done some nice papers on the tragedy of the commons and the use of this punishing beam to see whether or not the agents will figure out how to solve the tragedy of the commons problem. We don't have a tragedy of the commons problem in our setup. So we gave our agents this punishing beam, and then we introduce a classification scheme, which is implemented that says, let's suppose there's a taboo on the poisonous berry. So if we think about what does that mean? Well, that means that agents effectively will be rewarded for punishing an agent who's eaten the taboo berry. And that's like, okay, if you eat dog, like maybe people will criticize you, or they won't invite you to their parties anymore, or they won't hire you because you violated the rule. And that's an important rule, because actually, if the agents punish people for eating the poisonous berry, maybe they'll get better at avoiding the poisonous berry, not because they'll figure out it makes them ill 100 steps later, but because, oh my gosh, people are getting rewarded for punishing me after I eat the poisonous berry, because it shows up as a marking of that agent. I eat the poisonous berry, I change color from the perspective of other agents, and you get that, they get rewarded. We don't really know, we don't have good theories yet for why people in fact punish, third-party punishment. That's a key thing about humans. So this is an implementation of, well, what we know is that humans do go around punishing people all the time, criticizing, mocking, excluding people who violate the rules. We need to work on why that happens, but in this model, it's implemented in that way.
So now that you've kind of laid out this foraging game, can you explain how silly rules fit into this and what the findings were that you found?
So in the final treatment in our experiments, this is a computational experiment we're running, I think we have we have 45 populations of groups that are running through this game in different conditions. So we introduced what we call the silly rule condition, which is where we have a taboo on a random harmless berry. So the community has the important rule: don't eat the pink berries. And then we say, and don't eat the green ones. The green ones are actually harmless. They don't do anything to your health. And we introduce a silly rule, and then we look at and we compare across these different communities. No rules, which, as I said, they never learn to avoid the poisonous berry. The important rule condition, which we find they do learn to avoid the poisonous berry because it's taboo and they get punished. Critically, agents learn to punish people who've broken the taboo. They learn that there's a reward there and they learn that behavior. When we introduce the silly rule, we find that our agents learn to enforce the rules faster and more reliably. And then everybody learns to follow the rules sooner and more reliably. So what that means is that because we've introduced the silly rule, it's improved the capacity to have this normative infrastructure. And then that normative infrastructure, which consists of enforcement behaviors, punish somebody who breaks the rules, and compliance behaviors, don't do the things that get you punished. If that set of behaviors has stabilized, now you can say, okay, don't eat the poisonous berry. And so what we find is there's actually higher total welfare for this group because they get so much better at enforcing and following rules that now that infrastructure is sitting there and it can take the values you put into it. So if you want to put the value in, don't eat poisonous berries, then that's a value. You can get that value better. So this moves your focus away from what norms should we have and how will societies develop norms, particular norms, blue, pink berries, green berries, and gets you focused on how are you going to build the normative infrastructure, which is now this fantastic thing. Because maybe you discovered that the yellow berries also cause problems, or maybe the yellow berries are rare and they're especially great, and we now do have a competition problem and a tragedy of the commons, right? So can we get a rule that says don't eat more than one yellow berry an episode? Right? We haven't run that experiment. That's the next one, sort of the series of things we'd like to get to. But so the result with the silly rule is we see fewer poisonous berries eaten, we see less time spent poisoned, we see higher overall, we see less punishment overall, even though there's twice as many taboos to be broken. So you kind of get this, you get more stable, faster stable social order with the silly rule. So that's our result.
Does this just mean that having more silly rules is always better? Or how should we think about collective returns?
I think what we would say is we've shown that there's a benefit to having silly rules and that they may be playing a very important function, not in their direct material impact, but rather in their role in helping to create and maintain and sustain a normative infrastructure. In the earlier paper I mentioned with McCain Andrus and Dylan Hadfield Bunnell, we did show that the silly rules can't be too expensive. They have to be kind of cheap, which is also why it's wear a red ribbon, wear your hat with the brim to the left rather than to the right. I mean, it's that they're kind of cheap, relatively low cost to enforce and comply with. So because we ran computations, and it's a different setup, but we ran computations that said if they're too expensive, then no, it's not worth it. So that's that. So it won't. It's not a result that says, just because one is a good idea, any number at any cost would be a good idea. So that's not the way an economist would think about it. But I think what it does say is we've drawn attention to the importance of what are your mechanisms for establishing and maintaining normative social order. So suppose you're trying to create norms in a new community. We'd probably all sit around and say, okay, let's just pick important rules. And this kind of says, you know what? You may want to throw in some silly rules there. Like, here's how we greet each other when we walk into the room. Here are the foods we do or don't eat when we sit down for a meal together. Here's the way we keep the minutes for our meetings. We do them in this color font versus that color font. Because one of the things that silly rules are doing, so we just showed that they help people learn to enforce and follow rules. In our earlier paper, we also said they help provide information about how stable your rule system is. And lots of rule systems are under threat kind of in a constant way. We've got new employees. We've got new people who've joined the group. Do they follow the rules? Are they going to be helpful in enforcing the rules? If they stop, saying the greeting when we walk into our meeting room in this way, like, who are those weird people? Because what the silly rules are giving you information about is the stability of the system. And that's actually goes back to this point about, like, what is it we want common knowledge about? What do we want confidence in? We want confidence in, okay, they got rules around here. I think I can figure them out. And I have some confidence the rules are actually working, that they're actually being followed. I don't just see that on the books they've said, don't steal people's property. I can see that people in this neighborhood watch out and help make sure that nobody's stealing the property. And I think one of the things that we're pointing to, and I think there's lots of room for more work on this, is I think we've probably got a ton of cognitive architecture that's dedicated to tracking what's happening with those silly rules, because the value of them is they're all over the place. It doesn't really matter if they don't get followed, as I say, from a direct material point of view, but they're giving you lots of information and they're telling you stuff right now that might matter for something in the future, right? Like, I don't want to stay a member of this, say you're a member of a small religious community and, has lots of rules about who you marry and how children will be cared for and how sick people will be treated and so on. Well, you're going to make a lot of commitments, right? If you say, I'm going to stay within this small community, because you're not going to date other people, or you're not going to take out health insurance or get a job in another community or whatever. But if that community is starting to fall apart, if it's saying it's just too hard to maintain our small religious community, your first clues about that will be when people start eating what they weren't supposed to eat or not showing up for prayers at the right time, right? That will give you that indication of, gosh, I better think about whether or not this is too risky a proposition for me, because the important rules, like about family and work and so on, may not be enforced. And I think that's constant.
It's an interesting link, right, to like kind of small c conservatism, right? And I guess like worrying about these small rules or kind of like identity things as well, right? Being wary of kind of change.
First of all, I think it's across the board politically. I mean, lots of radical lefties have lots and lots of silly rules too. Like what word you use, don't use this word, use that word, dress like this. There's lots of silly rules everywhere. I don't think you can identify a group that doesn't have silly rules. But what it might tell you is how worried is a group about the stability of the norms that it cares about. And a small c conservative may be saying, okay, I live in I feel greater threat about whether or not my values are going to be reflected, whether or not the things that matter to me are going to be protected. And this theory actually predicts that you would see a lot of attention to the silly rules there. Because, like, why do I think we've got cognitive architecture that makes us so reactive to like, don't you feel terrible if somebody like gives you a dirty look in the cafe because they think you cut in line or something? Like, I don't know, maybe I'm just an obsessive type, but it can ruin my day if somebody thinks I did something wrong like that. And I think we have lots of cognitive architecture that has structured us to be very alert to those indicators because they are telling us something important. They are telling us something important about, in this environment, this is how you signal that you're a member of the community. In hunter-gatherer groups, the primary mechanisms of enforcing the norms are making fun of people, mockery, criticism, right? But if you ignored all those small little, paper cut type payoffs, well, you might get kicked out of the group.
Okay, I have one more question about these silly rules before we move on to our closing questions. If you look around in the world, there are a bunch of rules that kind of resemble silly rules, but maybe they come in two kinds. One kind is the useful version, where they, like you said, are going to give you information about the stability of the entire kind of rule set, or they're useful for kind of bootstrapping important rules. And then the other kind are, I guess you might just call them like truly silly rules, where maybe they once were useful, or maybe they're useful in very different contexts. But in this context, they are in fact doing nothing. They're just kind of hurting us and we're still like hanging on to them. Maybe an example might be food prohibitions or taboos, which once were useful when we were less able to treat food and hold higher hygiene standards, and now they're not doing much at all. And I guess my question is, how many of these kind of silly looking rules in the real world do you think belong to this first useful category, and how many are just in fact genuinely useless?
I'm not sure if I have an estimate. I mean, I think it's so. I very much hope that we are starting a lot of research on silly rules, because there isn't actually a lot of research, and it's not very well theorized. So it might be things like it's a marker of group membership, like you mentioned from an earlier conversation you had. And I'd say, okay, but now why are you signaling your membership in the group? So we have a story about that, which is the group is structured by its rules, its important rules. And so you're showing your membership in the group because it's the group that is enforcing the rules, and we're operating at that the group is its rules. I think that's an important point. So I don't know how many, but here's what I would say. I think you're exactly right. We're pointing to the fact there's a lot of different kinds of rules out there. There definitely are some that are just holdovers from this used to be an important rule and now it's not. It may actually be a very costly thing, right? So like gender differences and so on. There's probably a bunch of those there are a bunch of those that are just silly rules that historically may have played some important roles in coordinating family decisions and investments. And this was actually one of the first articles I ever wrote as an economist, was on a coordination model of the sexual division of labor. It said actually a sexual division of labor, the idea that women's jobs and men's job was performing a function in sort of a hunter-gatherer environment, which we don't need anymore, but nonetheless it's become a big organizing principle. I think there's a lot of silly rules that aren't performing much function, but this is why the important thing is to step back and say, so what about the structure? Like, where do they come from? The fact that we have a bunch we're so good at creating silly rules. Go on a camping trip with your friends. I guarantee after 3 days, you're going to have a whole bunch of rules, some of which will be important and some of which will be silly. I think we just produce them at great rates. And there's a question of, okay, so how do we trim them? How do we get rid of the ones that don't matter? And but recognizing we wouldn't want to get rid of all of them, right? That if you got rid of all of them, you actually would be living in a world that was much more uncertain, because you'd be throwing away important information about the stability of your group. And ultimately, that is the key to your success, is the stability of your group. Now you'd like to go change a better group. You'd like to change the important rules. You'd like to spend less time on the silly ones. But I certainly don't think anything I said stops us from critiquing. That's a silly rule, and that one we should get rid of, right? No problem there.
Yeah, I guess as we're kind of moving into the closing sections and things, I want to take maybe a bit of time reflecting on this like silly rules literature, which you said that there's loads of exciting things to do, and also the regulatory markets and this kind of, I guess, more like meta law research as well. We've got a bunch of kind of graduate students, PhD students, researchers, but generally lots of people kind of early on in their academic career who I'm sure are kind of like looking for interesting things to study. Are there like any particular areas where you would say, hey, this is really exciting stuff and I wish somebody was doing this work?
Oh, yes, absolutely. So I think there's real urgency for these, some real increased modeling, theorizing about human normative systems. I think I worry a great deal about the fact we are trying to solve the alignment problem. We are trying to make sure AI is safe and we're not destroying our societies with extremely simple-minded and just wrong understandings about the way human norms and normative structure work. So that's why I sometimes present the silly rules work as this is a demonstration project of why you need much more careful study and theorizing, because holy cow, it's more complicated than you thought. So I really do think that computational models of normative systems, I am looking for postdocs in that. Please reach out if anybody wants to do some work on this. I think computational models of how norms evolve, how legal infrastructure interacts with that. Let's answer Finn's question of, how do groups figure out which silly rules to get rid of and which ones to keep? Where do they come from? All of that, regulatory markets, thinking about the act. So really what I'm speaking to is the need for much more advanced social science, cognitive science, integrated across the social sciences and humanities in these areas. But if there was a shorthand for it, I'd say we need a whole lot more computational social science. And I think one of the key things is for it to be informed by this much richer understanding of human normativity. I mean, one of the things I haven't emphasized as much here is maybe the silly rules does it. The most important thing about our normative infrastructure is it can take on any content. If you manage to coordinate your group around that's not okay and we're going to punish you for it, you can put any content you want in there. For good, for bad, but this idea that there's universal human norms, there's things that are always true, we can figure out what those are and embed those in our machines, I just think that's really wrong and it's dangerous. And any norm you identify for me, I think I can, with enough time, find you a human society that says, oh no, we think that's okay behavior. You think it's outrageous, but we think it's okay. And so I think what's important is to study that normative infrastructure and then figure out how we're going to get machines to be good at playing with our normative, being a participant in our normative infrastructure. So computational social science, I guess, might be the shorthand for that.
Fantastic. And we will link in the write-up to a talk you gave about why the science of AI needs a science of normativity, which I suppose summarizes what you were saying. But the penultimate question we ask all our guests is, what significant thing have you recently changed your mind about and why?
So this is a challenging one for me. I've been thinking about all this stuff for so long, and part of what I'm celebrating is the fact that I'm back to ideas I started off with 35 years ago. I think probably I hesitate to share this because my basic stance on all of this has always been one of tremendous optimism about the capacity for human societies to change in the ways we need them to change. And of course, that's what I'm talking about. Like I'm sort of clanging the soup pans to say, hey, wait, look, we don't understand this stuff well enough. And it's a problem. So that's on access to justice. It's on regulatory technology. It's on how do we build safe AI. I think I have always been tremendously optimistic about that. I would say in the last couple of years, I've become more worried about the fragility of that. And I probably put a higher probability on we won't be able to do this than I have in the past. But let's say I don't really like to end there, because I certainly I won't stop working on it. And I don't think anybody should stop working on it. If anything, maybe we just have to realize it's more urgent than we realize. And we all have to become more flexible in our thinking.
Well, let's interpret that as a call to action rather than a note of pessimism. The last question we ask everyone is, what 3 books or articles, films, whatever, would you recommend to anyone listening to this and interested in finding out more about all the things we've talked about?
Oh, there's so many. And I know you have sort of, books on the alignment problem, Stuart Russell's Human Compatible, Brian Christian's The Alignment Problem, sort of just basic texts now on understanding, what we're facing, what we're dealing with. So let me mention books that I think would be mind expanding for people from this. So one is a book. I think I read it probably 20 years ago. It's Joseph Tainter, The Collapse of Complex Societies. It's actually I've heard a number of people mention it lately, which is a delight. It's an archaeologist who backed into sort of a economic theory of the idea of complex infrastructure and how you get diminishing returns to an existing complex infrastructure. It initially solves your problems well, and this might be the way the Romans organized their societies, or the way the Mesoamericans stored grain, traded it, massive architecture that was used. But it's the idea that there's a technology that evolves for solving the problems of complexity, but that there's diminishing returns. As the society successfully becomes more complex, that original solution ceases to work as well. And collapse happens because the societies don't figure out, we need a new technology. So you can see how that's been influential for me, thinking about that's where I think we are. And maybe I think we're closer to that collapse possibility than I did in the past. So that's one. Another book that is a lovely book, and I think is really very helpful for thinking about the complexity of normative infrastructure, is Christina Bicchieri, The Grammar of Society. And I love her work. She has a different way of thinking about norms than I do. It's compatible, it's coherent, but we're not completely aligned here. But I think I love this, first of all, just the title, The Grammar of Society, right? That you can't construct communicative sentences without grammar. And I think just that deep understanding of normativity is for those who have not looked at sort of theories of norms. And then she has a wonderful series of papers and experiments, and just will return the effort. So if you don't know about her, you should read her work. The last one is fiction. Kazuo Ishiguro's recent novel, Clara and the Sun, which is both just a lovely, lovely book to read. I read it in a single day sitting by a pool in Carmel Valley, so that helps probably my sense of it. But it is so effective at so Clara is an artificial person, and it is written, she writes the book. She's the first person narrator in the book. And, giving some access to thinking about, okay, what would it mean to have artificial people in our midst, and how would we treat them? It's a beautiful book, and it's really mind-opening.
Gillian Hadfield, thank you very much.
Thank you. This has been terrific.
That was Gillian Hadfield on regulatory markets, silly rules, and why humans invented law. I should also flag that Gillian has written her own book called Rules for a Flat World, Why Humans Invented Law and How to Reinvent It for a Complex Global Economy. It's also out now as an audiobook, so chances are, if you enjoyed listening to this interview, you'll also fancy giving this a go. As always, if you want to learn more, you can read the write-up at hearthisidea.com/episodes/Gillian. There you'll find links to all the papers and books referenced throughout our interview, plus a whole lot more. We'd be really grateful if you could also leave us an honest review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you're listening to this. If you have constructive feedback, there's also a link on the website to an anonymous form, or you can get in touch with us directly by emailing feedback@hearthisidea.com. And lastly, if you want to support the show more directly and help us pay for hosting these episodes online, you can also leave us a tip by following the link in the description. Thanks very much for listening.